presentation on Admiral Sun-Shin. I don't know if I'm saying that right. So the Admiral is considered to be one of the greatest heroes of Korea. He's even sometimes compared to King Sejong, as we went from earlier presenters that King Sejong was very influential in Korea. He's also compared by historians to a British admiral named Hideyoshi Nelson, who was known for his unconventional battle strategy and naval tactics. And the admiral was also known for those types of things. So my presentation is looking at characteristics that the admiral gained in his youth and in his early military career that can be later seen in his involvement in the Hideyoshi invasion. So I looked at 2 points in his life: first, his childhood and his young adult life. One thing that I found important was his parentage. His father was a Neo-Confucian scholar that did not take a position in the court because he saw the corruption and the political strife that existed among the members, and decided that he did not want his family nor himself to be involved in such issues. So he decided to take him, his wife, and his 3 sons to a small town, which name I cannot pronounce, so I'm not going to, and raise them there away from the corruption. I believe that this would aid the admiral in being able to connect better with his soldiers, who would have also been brought up in a poorer, less politically involved circumstance, and also when he was an admiral, he could be seen among the common soldiers. I think this is a direct correlation between his more poor and obscure upbringing and his ability to connect to these poorer, more common soldiers. The next thing was his education. Because his father was a scholar, he saw the importance of having an education, so he made sure that all 3 of his children were enrolled in school. The admiral's classmates often admired him for his vivaciousness and desire for education, and saw his talents in education. He actually, in fact, translated a book from Chinese to Korean when he was young, just so he could understand it. And he would also study books over and over again, just so he would be able to understand the concepts. His determination and desire to have such a good education would actually help him improve his military status when he was asked by a senior officer his opinion about a Confucius book that the officer did not think he would know. The admiral was able to give a satisfactory answer to the senior officer's questions, and the senior officer was so impressed that he was able to be promoted to a higher position. Next was war games. So as a child, the admiral and his playmates would often try and defeat Napoleon Bonaparte, or their imaginary Napoleon Bonaparte. And he was often chosen as leader, even though he didn't possess the characteristics of being very forward and very out there. He was more of a reserved child. They chose him because he was often established a rule system, and he kept the rules and was very rule-based when it came to playing these games, so everyone got a fair chance, and they were able to subdue Napoleon every time. So the next part of his life I looked at was his early military life. So, as we talked about in class, during his first attempt at the national examination to become a junior officer, he was thrown from his horse and broke his leg. His examiners thought that least of all he would pass out, or that he would stop taking the exam, but he got up, bandaged his own leg, got back on the horse, and finished the exam, which is a medical feat that I don't think can be replicated. But it just kind of demonstrates his resolve and his resilience to situations that would have been difficult for any normal person to face. This type of resilience would also aid him later on in his military career. Next thing was at the training center. At his second military post, he was put in this training center at Seoul, which was mostly done for administration work. During his time there, he was asked by a senior officer to falsify a document that would allow a friend of the senior officer to be promoted, but the promotion was not in line with the normal succession of promotions that normal people would go through. So he knew that either if he refused to, he would be, I was want to say disavowed, but it's not disavowed, kicked out of the military, or he could maintain his integrity and refuse to. He ended up refusing to falsify the document, and rather than being kicked out of the military, the defense minister found out about his actions and actually offered him one of his daughters as a concubine. The admiral refused because he was married at the time, and still was at the end. But but even just the fact that he was offered such a connection would have been very advantageous to him, and also gained him notoriety in the military. The last part was fighting the Jurchens. So this, later on in his early military career, he was asked to defend an island on the northern border of Korea from the Jurchens. The Iron Island, I do not know how to say it as well. He appealed to his general for more military support, just because he feared that any Jurchen force that would come in would be too much for his small army to handle. The general actually refused him forces, and when the Jurchen finally did attack them, he was able to drive them off through a series through good military control, and also the weather was incredibly foggy that day. But during the battle, he was actually shot in the leg with an arrow, and he pulled it out himself and continued fighting. This, to me, represents the fact that he probably knew that if his soldiers had seen him fall or seen him injured, there would probably been a lot of turmoil, a lot of chaos in his soldiers that may have lost him the battle. But because he pushed his own feelings aside and his own pain aside, he was able to keep the battle together and actually defeat the Jurchens. So next I want to look at how were these characteristics that he learned as a child and in his early military life, how were they seen in his military efforts during the Hideyoshi invasion. And so I picked out several instances where I thought that he demonstrated these characteristics through his actions. The first one was with his soldiers just in general. Many times during naval battles, the Japanese would be defeated, and many of them would flee to the shore and run off into the hillsides or wherever. Many people would have seen it as advantageous for the admiral to deploy some of his men to go and kill the fleeing Japanese, but instead the admiral would take into account his men, the condition they were in, the numbers he had, the weather, the time of day, and if it wasn't beneficial, substantially beneficial to his army or to his navy to kill the Japanese, then he would refuse to let them go after the Japanese. And by doing so, it just shows his presence of mind and his overall perspective of the war, seeing what would be more advantageous, what would be less advantageous. Another way he demonstrated his perspective was through his caring for the people. Also, many times in naval battles, he would have the opportunity to either capture many of the Japanese ships or destroying them. But instead of doing that, he worried about the Japanese people that made it to the shore. He worried about them becoming marauding groups and taking out their vengeance upon the innocent Korean civilians. So rather than doing that, he would allow the Japanese fleet to stay intact in some instances and allow the civilians not to be harmed, just demonstrating his perspective and on military, whatever. Okay, so the next one was false accusations. During the war, there was Japanese planted intelligence that the Japanese Navy would be at a certain spot on a certain date, and the king ordered the admiral to go after the Japanese and destroy them, essentially. When the admiral found out about this information and got the order, he realized who the information was from and realized that it was a faulty source and knew that he would probably be sailing into a trap. So rather than doing that, he refused. He was actually arrested and recommended that he be put to death. So he wasn't later on. He was released by some higher-up friends of his pleading to the king to let him go. But just this demonstrates his integrity, like we saw when he refused to follow the orders of the senior officer in the training center. He just preserved his integrity and preserved his men by following what he knew was right. The last thing was in his death. It's very tragic, but during the last naval battle of the war, he was shot in the side by, I think it was a cannonball, I'm not entirely sure, and rather than have his men see him die, he asked his nephew, who had seen him been hit, to cover him with a shield. I know Dr. Peterson said that they held it to the mast. In the two accounts that I read, he was covered with a shield, but I kind of like the masked version better. But anyway, so he was covered with a shield just so his men nor the enemy would see him fall. This is almost a mirror of the Jurchen battle when he removed his own arrow, because he realized that if his men saw him fall, they would probably go into chaos, they would feel defeated because their commander had fallen, or if the Japanese saw him fall, then they would rally their spirits, may have changed the outcome of the battle. So that just demonstrates his perspective and his understanding of the importance of his role in the military and his role in the eyes of his men. So in conclusion, the Admiral became one of the greatest heroes of Korea because of the characteristics that he developed as a child and in his early military career, and he's able to display these characters during the Hideyoshi invasion